April 24, 2018. Citrus Heights, California. A quiet street. Modest houses. The kind of suburb where nothing much happens. Where people mow their lawns and take their bins out on Tuesday and wave to their neighbors from the driveway. An elderly man comes out of one of those houses. Gray-haired, 72 years old. He walks to his car to get something. A team of investigators calls his name. He turns. And the man standing there, in the driveway of his childhood home, is the most wanted unidentified serial killer in American history. His name is Joseph James DeAngelo, and for 44 years, he had been hiding in plain sight. There was something those investigators already knew, standing there on that driveway. Something they had known before they ever walked up to his door. They already had his DNA. Not from a crime scene. Not from a database. From his rubbish bin. A discarded tissue, retrieved from the curb like any piece of ordinary household waste. He didn't know. He never suspected. Because the thing that finally caught him wasn't a detective, or a tip, or a cold case database. It was a retired patent attorney, working from a laptop, in her spare time. Welcome to Unfinished Dossier. If you believe justice should never have an expiration date, subscribe now. Because this story is not just about one killer. It is about the moment one arrest changed crime fighting forever. Before I tell you what Joseph DeAngelo did, I want you to understand who he appeared to be. Because that is the thing that makes this case different from almost any other we have covered on this channel. He was not a drifter, not a loner, not someone the neighbors found strange. He was one of them. Joseph DeAngelo was born in 1945. He served in the United States Navy. He studied criminal justice. He became a police officer. He married. He had children. He had a house, a garden, a car in the driveway. For decades, the people who lived around him knew him as a grumpy old man. Unremarkable. Forgettable. The perfect disguise. Because it wasn't a disguise at all. But there is one detail from his life before the crimes that I think you need to hear. Because it tells you something about the man beneath the disguise. In 1970, DeAngelo proposed to a woman named Bonnie Caldwell. She accepted. And then, wisely, she broke the engagement off. DeAngelo's response was not grief. It was not silence. He put a gun to her head and tried to force her to marry him. She got away, but that moment never left him. Years later, during his attacks on victims, witnesses would hear him sobbing in the dark, muttering the same words over and over. I hate you, Bonnie. I hate you, Bonnie. A man terrorizing strangers, still fighting a battle with someone who had simply chosen to leave. Remember that detail, because it explains something about the shape of his rage. And here is the detail I want you to hold, right from the beginning, because it is the crack in everything. In 1979, Joseph DeAngelo was fired from his job as a police officer in Auburn, California. Not for violence, not for misconduct, not for anything that would have raised a flag. He was fired for shoplifting. A hammer. And dog repellent. A hammer. The tool of a man who broke into homes. Dog repellent. The tool of a man who needed to silence animals before he slipped through a window in the dark. He stole the exact instruments of his crimes from a store and walked out of the police department with a dismissal. And then he kept going for 7 more years until 1986. The police department that fired him knew he had stolen a hammer and dog repellent. They had no idea they had let a serial killer walk out the door. Let me take you back further. Because the story does not begin in 1979. It begins in 1974. In a quiet corner of Central California called Visalia. From 1974 to 1975, someone was breaking into houses in Visalia. Not to steal valuables. To move things. To leave signs that he had been there. To let families know, without ever confronting them, that someone had been in their home while they slept. The police called him the Visalia Ransacker. They didn't know yet that they were looking at the beginning. A detective named McCowan got close. Close enough that DeAngelo shot him in the face during a confrontation in the dark and ran. McCowan survived. DeAngelo disappeared. If that bullet had been a fraction of an inch different, the story I am about to tell you might have ended 40 years earlier, and 13 people might still be alive. Before we go further, tell me where you are watching from. This case touched California, but it changed the way every country on Earth investigates its unsolved crimes. Drop your city and country in the comments. Let us see how far this story travels, because what came next was worse. Sacramento, California, 1976, a city of families. Neighborhoods where people left their windows open in the summer, where children rode bikes and screen doors banged in the evening breeze, and nobody locked everything the way we do now. He chose it deliberately. What began as the Visalia Ransacker now escalated. He was no longer just moving things in the night. He was entering homes while people were inside. He was binding them, terrorizing them, and leaving. Sacramento police called him the East Area Rapist. Over the next 3 years, he carried out more than 50 attacks across the Sacramento area. 50. Across multiple neighborhoods, multiple agencies, and no one connected them quickly enough to stop him. People bought dogs. He used dog repellent. People installed locks. He knew how to bypass them. Neighborhoods organized watch programs. He watched the watch programs and learned their schedules. He had an advantage that no ordinary criminal had. He knew how police investigations worked. Because he was police, he knew what detectives looked for. He knew what evidence mattered. He knew how to leave a scene with almost nothing behind. Almost. Because he did leave something. Every time. DNA. In 1976, DNA as a forensic tool did not exist. The technique would not be developed until 1984. Would not be used in American courts until 1987. DeAngelo was exploiting a gap in science that he could not have understood but somehow felt. He was the most dangerous kind of criminal, an intelligent one, operating in a window of time when his crimes were technically uncatchable. He made phone calls. Before some attacks, he would call his victims and breathe into the phone. After some attacks, he called back. He wanted them to know he was still there, that he could reach them anywhere. He even called police sometimes. Taunting. A voice, always disguised. Never traceable. Never caught. And then, in 1979, he changed again. The attacks moved south. To Santa Barbara County. To Ventura. To Irvine. And now, for the first time, he began to murder. Couples, primarily. Bound. Terrorized. Killed. He left personal items taken from homes as souvenirs, wedding rings, photographs, grim tokens of what he had done. Southern California investigators called him the original Night Stalker. They had no idea he was the same man terrorizing Sacramento. Because no one was comparing the DNA. 6 jurisdictions. Multiple agencies. Evidence sitting in separate vaults across the state of California. And a critical connection that would not be confirmed until the year 2001, when DNA finally linked the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker as the same person. 25 years after he began, 15 years after he stopped, they finally understood the scale of what they were dealing with. But they still did not have a name. And the man they were looking for was mowing his lawn in Sacramento. If you are still with me, and I need you to be, because the next part is where this story changes everything, hit that like button. And in the comments, tell me this. Did you think a case this size, this old, this cold, could ever really be solved? I want to know what you thought. Because what happened next, nobody saw coming. For 44 years, the Golden State Killer was the great unsolved case of American law enforcement. Not for lack of trying. Multiple agencies. Multiple task forces. DNA collected at dozens of crime scenes, but no match in any database. Every advance in technology tried. CODIS, the National DNA Index, checked again and again. Nothing. Because he had never given a DNA sample to the state. He was not in the system. And none of his crimes had left a living witness who could put a face to a name. There was a man named Paul Holes, a forensic investigator with the Kayenta County District Attorney's Office, who spent his entire career on this case. Not just years, decades. He tried every avenue. He pursued every lead. He consumed crime scene DNA sample after sample in the hope that new technology would finally give him something. Each time the technology improved, he tried again. Each time, the result was the same. And then, in the mid-2010s, something changed. Not in the labs. In the internet. Millions of Americans had begun uploading their DNA to genealogy websites. Not for criminal investigations. For personal curiosity. To find out if they were Irish or Italian. To discover cousins they had never met. To fill in the branches of family trees. They had no idea what they were building. Paul Holes had heard about a technique being used with genealogy databases. Investigative Genetic Genealogy. It had never been used on a case this size. Nobody knew if it could work. In March of 2017, he made a phone call. And now, before I tell you about that phone call, I need to tell you about a woman named Michelle McNamara. Michelle McNamara was not a detective. She was a true crime writer, a blogger, a woman who became so consumed by the case of the original Night Stalker that she spent years building her own private database of research, her own network of contacts, her own obsession with the face behind the crimes. In 2013, she wrote an article for Los Angeles magazine, and in that article, she gave him the name that would stick. Not the East Area Rapist. Not the original Night Stalker. She called him the Golden State Killer. That name did something. It unified the public's understanding of a man who had operated under many identities. It re-energized interest in the case. It may have contributed to the renewed push that eventually brought Paul Holes to that phone call in 2017. Michelle McNamara died in her sleep on April 21, 2016. She was 46 years old. She never knew how close she had helped bring the investigation to its end. Her unfinished manuscript, the book she had been writing about the Golden State Killer, was completed by her husband and her research team. Published in 2018, the same year they caught him. Her final words in that book: "You will be found. And then, you will be gone." She was right. She just did not live to hear it. Barbara Ray Vienter did not expect to change the world. She had a PhD in biology. She had spent her career as a patent attorney, specializing in biotechnology. And when she retired, she expected, in her own words, to work on her tennis game. Instead, she started volunteering for a nonprofit that helped adoptees find their birth parents through DNA. A hobby, a way to use her biology background in retirement. Something small and good. In 2015, a detective approached her about a case. Then another detective. And then, in March of 2017, Paul Holes called. He explained the case. The DNA. The decades. The dead ends. He asked if she thought it was possible to use genealogy databases to find the relatives of an unknown killer. She said she would try. Now, I want to walk you through what Barbara Ray Vienter did. In plain language. Because it is the most important thing in this entire story, and most people have never fully understood it. The Golden State Killer had left DNA at dozens of crime scenes. It had been collected, preserved, and stored for decades. But it had never matched anyone in the criminal database because DeAngelo had never given the state a DNA sample. What Barbara Ray Vienter did was go around the criminal database entirely. She took the crime scene DNA profile and uploaded it to public genealogy databases, JDMatch and Family Tree DNA, where ordinary members of the public had voluntarily uploaded their own genetic information. Not to catch criminals, to find distant cousins, to trace their heritage. But genetic relatives share DNA. Cousins share DNA. Even distant cousins, people who have never met, share measurable segments of genetic material. And some of those distant cousins had uploaded their DNA. The profile generated matches, not to DeAngelo himself, but to people who shared his genes, distant relatives, people who had taken a test to satisfy their curiosity about their heritage. From those distant matches, Barbara Ray Vienter began to build family trees. Backwards first. Back to great-grandparents. Great-great-grandparents. In the Golden State Killer case, the team needed to go back 5 generations before they could start working forward. Then forward through every branch, every son and daughter, every grandchild, narrowing, 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 eliminating people who were the wrong age, the wrong gender, who lived in the wrong part of California. It took 4.5 months. And at the end of it, investigators had a list of suspects, a real list, with names. And one of those names was a 72-year-old man in Sacramento, a retired police officer, living in his childhood home, putting his bins out on Tuesday. Investigators needed to confirm. They followed DeAngelo. They retrieved items he had discarded, a tissue thrown away, ordinary household waste left on the curb. The Dr. Pepper detail. Investigators placed a can of Dr. Pepper near DeAngelo during a surveillance encounter, the same drink he had left at crime scenes decades earlier. He did not touch it. He did not acknowledge it. He later told prosecutors he feared leaving his DNA, unaware that they had already retrieved it from his bin, unaware that the game was already over. The DNA from the bin matched the DNA from the crime scenes. 44 years. 13 murders. And in the end, a retired attorney doing genealogy in her spare time found him in 4.5 months. I need to step out for a moment, because Barbara Ray Vienter was not paid a detective's salary. She was not assigned this case. She volunteered. A retired woman with a biology degree and a hobby changed the way the entire world investigates violent crime. If this story has moved you, share it. Not for me. For her. For Paul Holes. For Michelle McNamara, who never got to hear the ending. For every person who waited 40 years. Share it so the right people get the credit they deserve. Because what Barbara Ray Vienter built did not just catch one killer. It caught everyone who thought they were safe. Here is the thing most coverage of this case never explains. When DeAngelo's distant cousins uploaded their DNA to JD Match to find out where their ancestors came from, they had no idea they were potentially making every biological relative findable by law enforcement, without being contacted, without consenting, without even knowing. If you have ever taken a 23andMe test or an Ancestry DNA test or uploaded your genetic data to any public database, you have potentially made yourself, your parents, your children, and your cousins locatable by investigators working a violent crime case. This is not theoretical. Since DeAngelo's arrest, investigative genetic genealogy has been used in more than 500 cases worldwide. Rapists, murderers, people who believe their anonymity was absolute. April 24, 2018 did not just end one case. It ended the era of genetic anonymity for violent criminals. Forever. Stay with me, because the courtroom is next. And what happened there, what the survivors said, what DeAngelo said after 40 years of silence, is the part of this story nobody who was there will ever forget. August 2020. Sacramento State University ballroom. Not a courtroom, a ballroom. Because there were too many survivors to fit in a normal room. The hearing had to be held during the COVID-19 pandemic. A university ballroom converted into a makeshift court to allow the 150 people present to be safely distanced. And even then, only a fraction of his victims were in the room, because he had 87 known victims at 53 crime scenes across 11 California counties. In June of that year, Joseph DeAngelo had pleaded guilty to 13 first-degree murders, to 13 counts of kidnapping, to 161 crimes in total, including dozens of rapes for which the statute of limitations had expired. In exchange, the death penalty was removed from consideration. He would die in prison, multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, no appeal rights, no way out. And now, in August, came the 3 days of victim impact statements. And then, on August 21, 2020, before Judge Michael Bowman handed down his sentence, Joseph DeAngelo did something no one expected. He stood up from that wheelchair, removed his mask, and spoke. I listened to all your statements, each one of them. and I am truly sorry for everyone I have hurt. 40 years of silence. And that is what he chose to say. What those words mean or do not mean to the people who heard them is not for me to say. Some survivors have spoken about finding a measure of something in that moment. Others have said it meant nothing. That sorry is not a currency that purchases anything back. What I can tell you is that Judge Bowman sentenced him to die in prison, and that under the terms of his plea agreement, he has no right to appeal. There is one more person I want to name before we leave this courtroom. A woman named Phyllis, one of the survivors. A woman who attended every single court hearing throughout the entire process. Every pretrial appearance. Every session. She was not there for the guilty plea in June. The sentence was handed down without her. Phyllis had died. Between the arrest and the guilty plea. She had waited 40 years. And she almost made it. Michelle McNamara spent years hunting him and never knew he was caught. Phyllis attended every hearing and did not live to see the plea. Tell me in the comments, who would you most want to tell about this outcome tonight? Whose name should we say? Joseph DeAngelo is 79 years old as of 2025. He is alive. He is in a secure facility in California, in a protected unit. He will die in prison. That part is certain. But his case did not die with his conviction. It lives in every cold case investigation open since April 2018. Since the arrest of Joseph DeAngelo, Investigative Genetic Genealogy has been used to identify suspects in more than 500 cases worldwide. Murders, rapes, unidentified remains, cases that had sat cold for decades. Barbara Ray Vienter went on to found Firebird Forensics Group, a nonprofit dedicated to helping law enforcement identify suspects in violent crimes and give names to unidentified victims. Paul Holes retired on March 29, 2018. DeAngelo was arrested on April 24, 2018, 26 days after he left. He never got to make the arrest himself. There are still open questions in this case. Investigators believe DeAngelo's crimes may extend beyond what has been formally confirmed. His spree began in 1974, possibly earlier. And then there is the question that the DNA can answer, but the courts never will. Where was he keeping his trophies? The wedding rings, the photographs, the items taken from the homes of the people he murdered. He admitted to having them. They have never been found. Some files stay open. Even when the verdict is in, I want to leave you not with Joseph DeAngelo. I want to leave you with the people who deserved better than 40 years of waiting. The 13 who were murdered. The 87 who survived and lived for decades with what he did. The people who stood in a ballroom in Sacramento and looked at the man who had destroyed parts of their lives and chose to speak anyway. And the people who never stopped looking. Paul Holes, who gave his career to one question and almost did not live to see its answer. Michelle McNamara, who said you will be found, and then you will be gone. Who was right about everything, except the timing. Barbara Ray Vienter, who just wanted to work on her tennis game. He is gone. Into a cell where he will die. But this case will outlive him, because what caught him is still out there. Still running. Still narrowing down lists of names and cases that have been cold for decades. If you have information about any crime connected to Joseph DeAngelo, you can contact the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office at sacta.org. Before you go, subscribe to Unfinished Dossier, like and share. Not for me. For the cases still waiting. For the files still open. For the families still asking. Subscribe, and never let a case go cold. Every file has a story. Not every story has an ending. This one finally did.